Hello, everybody. Welcome. You've joined us for Love and Sex Behind the Iron Curtain, 20th Century State Socialism in Eastern Europe. My name is Kateřina Morris. I'm on DSA's International Committee, this is a co-production of the International Committee, DSA SocFem, and Lux Magazine. We're going to get started in just a minute. Paulina Aronson will be introducing the program today. Thanks. Paulina?
Hi, everybody. It's really great to see all of you here. My name is Paulina Aronson. I am a sociologist and a journalist. I do research in the area of sociology of emotions, and I also work as an editor for the Russian language section of Open Democracy. And I'm really, really happy to introduce my three wonderful colleagues and my friends to big extent, Kristen, Ghodsee, Kateřina Lišková, and Agnieszka Krishanska. I'll introduce the three ladies in alphabetical order to me. So I'll start with Kristen. Kristen Ghodsee is a professor of Russian and Eastern European studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of 10 books, including Red Hangover, Legacies of the 20th Century, and Second World, Second Sex, both published by Duke University Press. And Kristen also writes for non-academic publications, and she publishes in places like the New York Times and Foreign Affairs and Jacobin magazines and many others. And in fact, her most widely read book is a nonfiction based on her academic research, but very accessible to non-academic readers, with a very provocative title, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, which was published in 2018 and since then has been translated into many languages, including the Eastern European languages. And I'm sure Kristen will tell us a lot today about how her book was received and the parts of the world she is writing about. And Kristen spent years researching what happened to women in countries that transitioned from state socialism to capitalism. And she argues that unregulated capitalism disproportionately harms women, and that we should learn more from the past, and that by rejecting the bad and salvaging the good, we can adapt some socialist ideas to the 21st century. And I'm sure there will be a lot to discuss on that front today. Our second participant is Agnieszka Krishanska, and she's an anthropologist, and her primary field of research is Polish sexology and sex education. And Agnieszka has a professorship in the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Studies in the University of Warsaw, and currently she's also teaching in Oxford. And she's been on a variety of fellowships all over the world. The list is very long, but I will mention Harvard and the New School. Agnieszka is the author and co-editor of several volumes on gender and sexuality, including To See a Moose, The History of Polish Sex Education, and Gender, Pleasure and Violence, The Construction of Expert Knowledge of Sexuality in Poland. And Agnieszka is drawing her research on participant observation, on archival materials, and of course on interviews with a variety of experts and with people who received this expert advice. And her main argument is that before the 1989, sexual expertise in Poland was actually a lot more progressive than afterwards. And we will find out more today about how this seeming paradox could have happened. And finally, I'm very happy to introduce Kateřina Lišková, who is an associate professor of sociology in Masaryk University in Czech Republic in Brno. And her research focuses on gender, expertise, sexuality, and social organization of intimacy in Central and Eastern Europe. Kateřina has just published a wonderful book called Sexual Liberation Socialist Style, Communist Czechoslovakia and the Science of Desire from 1945 to 1989. Has come out in 2019 in Cambridge University Press and has won a lot of recognition in the academic and also non-academic readership. And Kateřina reveals in her work how in the case of Czechoslovakia, very important aspects of sexuality were actually very liberated by the 1950s. And, abortion was legalized, homosexuality decriminalized, the female orgasm has become a focus of research. And then later, during the process of normalization, after the Soviet tanks rolled into Prague, things went south to some extent. And good sex was to cement a lasting marriage and family, and gender discourses were reversed, and women were to aspire to be caring mothers and docile wives. Kateřina's main argument is that, in contrast to the usual Western accounts highlighting that the importance of social movements to sexual liberation, in Czechoslovakia, we discover a variety of ways in which experts, such as demographers and sexologists and psychologists, advised the state on population development, marriage, and the family to shape most intimate aspects of people's life. So we have three wonderful speakers today with a very broad and very deep expertise in women's lives, women's sexuality, love, sex, and intimacy behind the Iron Curtain. And personally, I would like to start this conversation with all three of you and with our participants with a very graphic image of which demonstrates the difference between what looks like the Soviet femininity and the Western capitalism femininity. I will share my screen with you. There you go. The ladies on this picture in the middle are Jackie Kennedy, who of course you all recognize, and next to her is Nina Khrushcheva, the wife of Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, who went to the US in 1959 and brought his wife, the first lady of the Soviet Union, with him. And this picture never ceases to cause discussions, conversations, arguments on the Russian internet, because the contrast between the two women just seems to be huge. And there is a lot of comment now which highlights the femininity of American First Lady and the seeming unfemininity of the Russian First Lady, the beauty, the freedom, the clear sexuality of the American president's wife and the unsexuality of the Russian First Lady. And the question here is, what do we actually see here? What is this picture telling us? Is it telling us that the lady on the left is really free, emancipated, living a full sexual life, having a great time in her intimate life, and the lady on the right is oppressed, has no sexual desires, doesn't know what intimacy is, and as the famous saying about the Soviet Union goes, there is no sex in the Soviet Union. Is it really true? What do we actually see here? Can we really suspect that women behind the Iron Curtain were not emancipated, or were they emancipated in some other way, not like Jackie Kennedy? Kristen, I invite you to start.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your very generous introduction. And I have so many things that I'd love to say about that photo. I do think that one of the most important things to say about that photo is that it has contributed to so many stereotypes about women in the former countries of the Eastern Bloc, but particularly of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that I know Agnieszka and Kateřina and I really want to talk about today is the diversity of experiences. In the United States, we generally tend to have one vision of what life was like in 20th century state socialist countries in Eastern Europe. And that vision in the United States is largely driven by Cold War stereotypes. and particular kinds of discourses that circulated in this country about how Soviet women might be equal, but they were unfeminine. And that because they were able to work, they didn't have time to care about their, their beauty, that these two things were mutually exclusive. In fact, I just saw an article, I found an article in 1957 edition of US News and World Report, which specifically says that Soviet women are unfeminine because they work outside the home. So clearly that image that you showed sort of perpetuates that interesting stereotype. Now, I think that obviously we can consider, Jackie Kennedy there as, obviously her husband, I think, is sleeping with Marilyn Monroe at this very moment. She is a kind of trophy wife. She's presented in a kind of commodified way. Her fashion sense, her poise, her femininity is something that's obviously being done for a male gaze. Clearly, that's not what's happening with Khrushcheva, right? There's no male gaze that's going to be pleased by that particular image of her. And so I think that that's a really interesting way to think about this. Who is consuming these images and for what purpose? But I also want to say, and I'll turn it over to my co-panelist here, that I do think that in many countries in the former socialist bloc of Eastern Europe, femininity was very highly prized. And a lot of women put a lot of work into dressing in a very fashionable way and actually making themselves appear feminine, in some ways even more so than American women, especially after the advent of the women's rights movement. So that there was often this interesting imbalance that American women come to be seen as somehow unfeminine, masculinized, and Eastern European women are the ones that are kind of overly feminine. So I think that we really have to strive very hard to challenge the stereotypes that we have about life in the Eastern Bloc before 1989 or 91, and also gender roles and women's roles in the Eastern Bloc, because there's so much that we could learn from these countries, and we're just not exposed to them and the knowledge that's being produced about them in the United States in this day and age. Agnieszka, do you want to jump in there?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I think that this image, when I look at this image of Khrushchev's wife, I think that it was, in many ways, in Poland, it was contested, and a lot of women wanted to look like Jackie, and especially after in the late 50s and in the 60s and onwards, this image of a Soviet women was really very much contested, but it came with a price, because that was also, this contestation also meant pushing out women from the labor market and pushing them into those feminine jobs, and going to feminine jobs meant earning less that they used to when they were doing all those male jobs before Khrushchev's era. So I think from the Polish perspective, this image is really it's really contested. I mean, the image of a Soviet woman was very much contested, but it was also when Polish women were not encouraged to dress very nicely and look very sexy, they could earn much better than they did later on. Kateřina, do you want to add something?
Yes. What we need to realize is, I guess maybe this audience is very much aware of that, but what happened at the very beginning of state socialism across the board was that with the class differences, also gender differences were being questioned, and the effort was to introduce equality. So not only on a class base, but also on the gender base. Equality between men and women was introduced to the legal codes, both for women who were able to enter higher education in growing numbers, also paid work. And also in their domestic sphere, women were for the first time put on equal terms with men. So wives could own the half of the property, could decide over their children, and could decide over themselves if and where they want to go to study, if where they want to go to work. They did not have to listen to their husbands and reside in the same home. So there was this experiment going on, which was attempting to change society on class and gender basis. And it is interesting how quickly women got used to that and kind of forgot that it was connected to socialism, really. Because not even 20 years after state socialism began, in Czechoslovakia specifically, there was the contestation of state socialism, and the reforms were being attempted and they failed. And after those failed reform attempts known as the Prague Spring, many people emigrated from Czechoslovakia. And there were educated women already who were leaving for the West, for example, West Germany. And they were very surprised that to get a contract with an employer meant that their husband needed to co-sign. When they wanted to get a bank account, their husband needed to co-sign. Nothing was free for West German women in the 70s in the free country that was West Germany. And these women were very much surprised because they thought, especially after what happened in Czechoslovakia in '68, that the West was the free land where people, irrespective of their sex, were to be free, only to find out that it was much more complicated, and that what socialism actually brought to them was an unparalleled level of gender equality.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing there, just to emphasize what Kateřina just said. There was a conference in Mexico City in 1975. It was the first World Conference on Women. And I interviewed a Bulgarian woman who said that when she was at the conference, she overheard some American women who were bragging about the fact that Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were now admitting female students as undergrads, and that it was only a matter of time before Columbia would do so as well. Columbia doesn't actually go coeducational until 1981. And she had heard that American women were not allowed to attend these elite prestigious universities, but she literally thought that it was communist propaganda in her own country. She did not believe that that was the actual state of gender, the situation of gender equality in the United States, that women were being banned from Harvard, until she overheard an American woman bragging about the fact that it had been accomplished in the last couple of years. And this was in the 70s.
So my question is then how is it possible that women in the USSR, where I was born in the 1980, for them, it wasn't at all clear that they actually enjoyed some special rights, you know, that their life was actually that their life could have possibly be better than the life of women in the West, because the interface of their lives was deficit of everything, deficit of, you know, stockings, and ending with deficit of proper medical care. And yet my grandmother defended a PhD in physics in 1949, and she was one of hundreds of thousands of women who had access to academic education and to academic degrees at that time. But she would never call herself a feminist. I think she would be appalled by the idea. My mother, who thinks God is alive, and we talk very often about those things, and she used to be an editor-in-chief in a newspaper, and she enjoyed all those things that you're talking about, you know, that socialism has ostensibly given to women. And yet she also does not understand the concept of feminism. She does not understand why is it important to talk about those things. And she does not think that Soviet Union has given her anything special. How is it possible that there is such a low sense of a reflection in the former socialist countries about what was maybe not so bad about socialism? And we have a comment here in the chat with one of our listeners stating that one of the greatest gains of the Bolshevik Revolution was the abolition of sexism. How come we didn't notice?
Kateřina, Agnieszka, do you want to jump in here and maybe bring some experience from other countries?
I always think that it is when people are given something from above, they don't think of it as anything else but natural. You know, it's theirs. It's theirs. Whatever. Who knows who gave it to us? People really very quickly forget that things were different even in their own lifetimes or the lifetimes of their parents. It's just normal because it's the law. Everybody has it. Everybody's there. Women at universities, women at workplaces, and people get really quickly. They get used to these good things in life, really, and this, what we are talking about today, about this bad image of communism, is also a retrospect image 30 plus years after state socialism had ended and was defeated by capitalism, right? So people's memories of what life was back then are also formed and tainted by what happened afterwards. And unfortunately, gender equality and many of these accomplishments get lumped together with all that bad communism. And we need to realize that, of course, communism did many things poorly. And of course, atrocities happened. And especially in the early 50s, when, as I said, gender equality was codified into law for the first time in those countries, right? So at the very same time, we have equalization of half the population, and let's call it mathematically imprecise, the bigger half, because women and even children got equalized in the law. And then at the very same time, you have political camps where prisoners are sent. You have people being robbed of their even very little property they had, because the idea was that people were not to own private property, such as land, right? So there were things that were happening that were very horrific at the very same time at this great equalization. And what we cannot do, especially nowadays, is to distinguish between the two and to say, yes, one is wrong. To put people in camps for their political opinions is absolutely wrong, but it is absolutely good to equalize women's standing with men's. And we need to realize that these things happening at the same time have a different ethical valence. And that we have problems with that, especially in retrospect.
Why do we need socialism for that? Aren't the Western states doing the same? I'm trying to provoke you here a little bit. Agnieszka, I see that you're...
Yeah, I just wanted to add what Kateřina just said about, thinking about the past. And I think from the Polish perspective is really interesting here, because the last few years of socialism in Poland is not the best period with the martial law and the total economic crisis. So all these things about gender equality were taken for granted because they were just there and people really didn't reflect on them. And but then what most people remember from socialism is its last years, which were not the best period of socialism in Poland. So I think it's really difficult to talk about these things in Eastern European countries, because people have their memories and they remember things they remember that they have to wait in line for food, and all those things related to gender equality were just obvious. And nowadays, when abortion was banned in Poland, now people remember, well, it was this time which was called socialism, where reproductive rights were so obvious for women, and they are not anymore. So I think that these are the things you take for granted, and then you just don't remember them. Sorry for barging in.
Yeah, no, I want to just add to that too. Where I do research in Bulgaria, I think that, you know, one of the things that we see pretty clearly is that there's actually quite widespread nostalgia these days for this particular period of the past, precisely around the social safety nets and the stability, right, that people had. Like, you knew that you were going to have a job, you knew that you were going to have water and heat, probably some medicine. No, you definitely didn't have jeans. You definitely didn't have like any really good consumer goods. But I also think that it's important to point out, and we were talking about this yesterday, the four of us, when we were on our own little private call, that there were really important differences. The Soviet Union had many, many more consumer shortages than a place like Czechoslovakia. And I think, Paulina, you gave this wonderful example of the maternity handbook that your mother read and what she was expected to pack to go to the hospital, right? And since the book had been written in Czechoslovakia, the advice for what a woman should bring to the hospital was completely different than it was what it could possibly be in the Soviet Union, because most of the things that women had access to in Czechoslovakia, you didn't have access to in the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union, you could not bring anything into a hospital by definition, because you were treated like an animal. You were stripped of all your possessions and just pushed, into some hospital robe, and nobody would attend to you. And the maternity hospitals were probably the most terrible experience any Soviet woman could go through. So I think these internal differences are really, really hugely important. And when we're talking about reproductive rights, it is well known that in the Soviet Union, abortion was the most widely spread means of contraception, which of course it's not meant to be. And we don't really know the exact figures, but my colleagues and your colleagues from Russia, from European University in St. Petersburg, they try to draw up on some statistics. And the assumption is that 6 or 7 abortions per capita per woman in the course of her lifetime was just a normal thing. This is definitely, not something we would wish any emancipated woman in any country. Can you maybe speak a little bit more about differences in sexual education and also in sexual health in countries behind the Iron Curtain, so that we don't lump it together and will really make very important differences here?
So I think Poland is an interesting example here, because we all know that the major feature about Poland is Catholicism. So you could think that in a Catholic country you cannot have any reproductive rights or any sex education, and this was just not true. So Poland legalized abortion in 1956, and all sorts of other forms of birth control were accessible, sometimes in shortage, but often not in shortage. And sex education was already introduced. Sex education more historically was in Polish schools already in the interwar period, but under socialism was introduced to Polish schools in the beginning of the 70s, with often quite progressive message about students would learn about contraception, would learn about gender roles. And the interesting things was that it was going more and more progressive in the 1970s and 80s. And in 87, there was this really super progressive sex book, handbook for sex education for 15 years olds, introduced into Polish schools. And the book was really extensive about contraception, really extensive about sexual pleasure. It really totally normalized homosexuality and transsexuality, and it was really very sex positive book. But it was just removed from schools under the pressure of the Catholic Church quite quickly. That was in 1987, and then the sex education in Poland after communism was prepared by exactly the same people who removed this progressive sex book from schools in 87. So then there is differently that we think about about progress, that that good things came from the West, and good things came with democracy and capitalism. And when it comes to sex education, it really got worse in the 1990s, and it's getting worse every year, and especially today. And the same with abortion, which was delegalized now first in 93, and now last year just almost completely. So I think that was sort of an image of Poland under socialism and later.
Yeah, and if I can just sort of plug this, the GDR. So in the East German context, this was a book that was published in 1969 in the GDR. It's called Man and Woman Intimately, and it is a very explicit and frank guide to human sexuality, which was widely made available. I believe it was the second most popular book sold in the entire history of the GDR. And it was translated. This copy that I have is the Bulgarian version. I don't know if you can see that. And it has really explicit instructions about things like that have to do with pleasure. And, there are some dated things here. It's not as progressive as one might imagine for 2021, but for its time, and for as widely as it was disseminated, because it was translated into many, many languages. It was translated into Spanish, and it made its way to Cuba. And from Cuba, it made its way all across Latin America, because in Catholic countries, having a book that was this detailed about human sexuality was really rare. Even, by the way, interestingly, the East German book found its way into West Germany. So just to emphasize what Agnieszka said, there was an East-West transfer of knowledge around sexuality. The East was far more progressive in an earlier period of time. And I know that Kateřina can tell us a lot of interesting things about Czechoslovakia.
Oh yes, sexological research was very progressive and very thorough in Czechoslovakia, and it's already in the 1950s. So in the decade when definitely in Western countries was mostly silence, and in many Eastern countries there was sexuality as such was not discussed or researched. The Sexological Institute in Prague was very active and was conducting research on the female orgasm. And how it came about is actually very typical of a socialist country, because countries after the war on both sides of the Iron Curtain were trying mostly to increase their fertility. In a state socialist country that was Czechoslovakia, problems with fertility were covered by national health insurance. So women who could not conceive were treated by medical doctors and also went to a specialized spa. And in this spa, in a small sweet town called Františkovy Lázně, there were thousands of women treated for infertility. And the local gynecologists who were talking to these women and of course examining them realized that about 10% of them did not have any somatic problems whatsoever. From the perspective of the gynecologist, these women could perfectly well conceive, yet they could not. And what united those women were their complaints about their marital life, which the gynecologists rightly understood as problems in sexual realm, and invited the sex doctors from Prague, who came and conducted a large survey with these women. They spoke to all these women in hour-long interviews and had a group for comparison of currently pregnant women. And these doctors and trained nurses were asking these women all sorts of questions about their life, about their education, their upbringing, their current life, their current workplace experiences, their marriage. And what they found out was that these women who could not conceive were 4 times as less likely to be loved by their husbands or to love their husbands than the women who were currently expecting a child. And these doctors realized that indeed, for marriage to be functioning, also in the sexual realm, the partners needed to love each other. And as many of you know, love and socialism are very old thoughts that go together. And to these doctors, it kind of rang true, right? These marriages were loveless, were based on convenience, but not love, not mutual respect. And of course, the sex life did not work. So that was the core of the problem. And then at the end of the decade, or at the end of the 1950s, there was a conference devoted specifically to the female orgasm, where medical experts actually concluded that for women to enjoy orgasm, to have satisfactory sexual lives, they needed to be equal to their husbands, who needed to participate in housework and to participate in childrearing. Without that, there could be no orgasm and no sexual happiness. And that was a fairly widely shared view. And those those medical experts at that conference were also aware of how overworked women often were, because, as we said, women obviously worked full-time and without housework technology and the help of their husbands, they were really tired. But those doctors also recommended to women not to quit their job, not to rest and do nothing. For a woman to be truly happy in life, she needed to work, because work was the source of self-worth and obviously money. And without that, women could not be happy. But it was the work of their husbands in their homes which was to bring sexual happiness to women, which I think is a very progressive notion by any standards, let alone in the 1950s, early 1960s.
Could I add to that, to say that also in Catholic Poland, female orgasm was widely discussed, although a little bit later. So I would like to show you a scan of one of the major, because Kristen showed the Bulgarian / Eastern German book, and Kateřina was talking about the Czechoslovakia. So this is this is a scan from the most popular Polish sex book, which sold 7 million copies. This was the book by Michalina Wisłocka, The Art of Love, or The Art of Loving. And then she has all those sexual positions and how the penis penetrates the vagina. I don't know if this kind of words could be used in the US, but then this is the Polish book from the late 70s, and this position is from the anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski, The Sexual Life of Savages. So she used it to present the book was really popular back then. So I think this and there were 30 pages of positions and orgasm achieved through certain positions. So I'm assuming that in Poland, orgasm also was important.
Yeah, and just to say, just again, the GDR example, what's really fascinating about this book is that it actually starts, when you read the introduction of the book, the first thing that you see are tables that describe what Zygmunt Schnabel calls the orgasm gap between men and women, right? And how, and what's wonderful about the book is this, the language of an enlightened socialist society is about achieving equality in all realms of our lives, including in the bedroom.
Okay, I have to, I can't keep it inside of myself. I really have to share it. A few years ago, I was in a relationship with an American man who lived in Berlin, and our first night together, I came into his house in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, and out of somewhere, he pulled out that very book, Kristen, and suggested that we read it loud to each other. So its popularity is still remaining. But jokes aside, I wonder what went wrong in the USSR, because everything you're talking about, it just doesn't ring any bell with me. And just a few days ago, I was reading the re-edition of a samizdat, self-published journal, Women and Russia, which came out in 1979 in Leningrad and was organized by a group of, what you could call them feminists, female activists from the USSR. One of them was imprisoned at the time. The others were, some of them didn't have jobs any longer because they were expelled from, the decent society. They drew up this journal, this collection of essays, which are very, very different. One of them is a believing Orthodox, was a believing Orthodox. The other ones were absolutely agnostic, and they were writing each about very different aspects of their lives, but the tone of the manual is a shout. It's a scream. They're screaming. They're writing about absolutely horrible experiences in very, very different realms of of life in the USSR, and there is just nothing that you could say, okay, maybe there is something to save there. What went wrong there? Why did we have it apparently so much worse than anywhere else behind the Iron Curtain?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's worth also mentioning here that Romania and especially Albania, there were real differences. The situation in Romania was really horrific for women after 1966. There was no contraception, no access to abortion. The state essentially nationalized women's wombs, and it was a very very hostile place to be a woman. And I think it's really important, again, as I said at the very beginning of this, event, that we should make big distinctions between the countries of the former Eastern Bloc. But, I think in the Soviet Union, if you go back to the 1920s and you read a book like Alexandra Kollontais' The Autobiography of a Sexually Emancipated Communist Woman, that was the name of her autobiography in 1926, and her essay, Make Way for Winged Arrows, there was an initial push to liberalize sexuality. Our colleague Dan Healy has written about the decriminalization of homosexuality in the Soviet Union. Abortion in the Soviet Union was legalized in 1920. So there was this really early period of liberal sort of sexual experimentation, which gets really shut down by Stalin with the 1936 Family Code. And Wendy Goldman's book, Women, State, and Revolution, really wonderfully traces all of the debates in the 1920s. And I think that it's, the answer to the question, as with so many things about what was wrong with the Soviet Union for so long, come back in some ways to Joseph Stalin. After Stalin dies, things start to liberalize again in the Soviet Union, but you never have the kind of sex education. You never have the kind of liberal discourse until the 80s, I think, with Gorbachev, right? It starts late. There are moments, right, where there are these openings. But I do think that it's really important, if you read a short story, the novella Week Like Any Other by Natalia Baranskaya, for instance, the suffering and the struggle that many Soviet women faced between trying to care for their families and trying to work full time, for instance, without the support of the state that they thought they would have, that Alexandra Kollontai hoped to give Soviet women. And then the male leaders in the Politburo don't really come through in those promises because they have other priorities. I do think that the countries of the Eastern Bloc who came to socialism after the Second World War, however, come at a moment when there's Cold War competition around women's rights. And, the East, to a certain extent, really was ahead of the game, as we've all spoken about here. And that becomes a kind of soft Cold War area where they can really say, hey, look, socialism is doing all of these good things for women, which then puts really important pressure on Western countries, on Western Germany, on the United States, on the UK, in France, everywhere. So, but unfortunately, I do think that when we look at the lived realities of women in the Soviet Union, it is not nearly as progressive as it was in other places in the Eastern Bloc, especially when we look at a place like Yugoslavia, which was non-aligned, which was very open to the West. People could travel. They didn't have the same level of shortages. They had much more, flexibility. I was really surprised to see the Yugoslav state actually produced sort of soft porn magazines.
My grandfather was, and he worked as an engineer in Yugoslavia, and he was bringing my grandmother underwear.
Yeah. Yeah, they had like sort of like soft erotica, which was, of course, as you can imagine, hugely popular in Bulgaria because they couldn't get that kind of stuff. So there was a huge difference. And depending on where you were, I think that the Soviet Union was a much more closed society around issues of sexuality than some of the other countries of Eastern Europe. Now, why that is a question about, that's a bigger question. Like, was that a function of socialism? Was that a function of sort of Russian Eastern Orthodoxy? Was that a function of sort of the differential makeup of urban versus rural populations? I mean, generally speaking, rural populations tend to be much more conservative in the sexual sphere. That helps explain a little bit about what was going on in Romania, for instance. But I think that these are these wonderfully fine-grained distinctions that we need to address when we talk about the experiences of 20th century state socialism, and that I hope that panels like this, try to get people to think about that this was a much more variegated and interesting and complex set of experiences than we've come to learn about, especially in the United States.
Can I just say one word to Kristen? What you are suggesting, what you are saying is that Eastern European countries such as Poland or Czechoslovakia or Bulgaria or East Germany, where in these countries certain early socialist ideas about women's emancipation were more advanced than in the Soviet Union. Yeah, I think that's an interesting interpretation to see how these countries were more socialist than the Soviet Union.
They were. I mean, remember, all of these countries, I mean, you guys know this, but all of these countries have early socialist movements, right, that date back to the early 20th century, even the late 19th century in some cases, right? And so, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg, right, was Polish before she emigrated to Germany. And I think that you have to remember that socialism as an ideal isn't born in the Soviet Union, right? Unfortunately, in the United States discourse, it gets completely, tarred with the experiences of the Soviet Union, but it's an ideal that's long predates the Soviet Union, has a longer history in Europe, and even in many of these socialist countries that became, communist after the Second World War. And that's the kind of thing that people, even in the region, people tend to think that like Soviet communism, comes, and it does after the Second World War through Soviet imperialism in many cases, but the origin of some of the ideas, especially as Kateřina said, this linkage between love and socialism, right? That goes back to like August Bebel writing in Germany in 1879. Those are discourses that are circulating well before the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1917.
May I throw one more thing in, which would speak to the post-World War II developments? Because socialist states are quintessentially modern states. They build themselves on modern ideas. And one of the very modern ideas is that of expertise. And I think there is a very, for me, persuasive correlation between the openness of discussions of sexuality and countries' progressiveness, and not gender, mind you, sexual, because I said gender was across the board, right? The countries liberalized gender codes at about the same time. But when we are talking about sexuality specifically, I think that correlates pretty well with how established particular experts were in those countries at a given point in time. So Czechoslovakia, as I said, did that research on the female orgasm during the 1950s. It did a very fundamental research on male homosexuality, based on which homosexuality was decriminalized in Czechoslovakia in 1961, way before it happened in Western countries. So it was solely expert fueled and driven. And I think also in Poland and in Hungary, the sexual matters get much more progressive when more experts jump in and seize the public imagination, And of course, expertise is a big currency in a modern society. And again, socialist states were modern societies, were prided themselves on expertise and modernity. And this is just one part of expertise that was very crucial.
Thank you. I would actually like to steer the conversation to some, slightly different focus. And, we're talking a lot about the sexuality and how women should be sexually pleased or not. And we have so far not really given much attention to women's labor rights in all those countries, because as one of our listeners has pointed out in the chat, that it's not the sexual positions which actually make bring the woman an orgasm. I guess we could all agree to that. Kristen, I guess one of the main arguments you make in your book, that of course it's not the positions, but it's the general sense of economic equality and of access to social goods, such as education, such as healthcare, such as childcare. What about the women's labor rights? How are women accepted to the labor market behind the Iron Curtain, and can we really claim that it contributed to their happiness?
Well, I think, of course, oh, go ahead, Kristen, you want to? Yeah, so I think it really contributed to their happiness, and because they gave them independence and social networks outside of traditional networks of family and kin networks, and it allowed them sort of balance in the relationships with their husbands, as they didn't depend on them financially. And of course, divorce was quite easy. I think it's all over the blog where you could quite easily divorce. And then there was this expertise, not only positions, which I mentioned, but that the comment I think also refer not only to labor rights, but also to other things you do to achieve orgasm, except from positions. So of course, these books discuss this too. So I would say that definitely there was the possibility to have a job and not to be dependent on your male partner. It was a huge step, but at the same time, I think we should remember that it was different in various moments. So, for instance, in Poland, women could get much better jobs in the early 50s, where they were allowed to work as miners or in various forms of heavy industry. And it didn't mean such a strong physical work, because sometimes there were a lot of machines that could support their work, but then they could earn much better than later on in those typical female jobs, which pay much less. So I think gradually the position of women on the labor market in Poland deteriorates. From in the 70s and 80s, they were pushed to more feminized positions on the labor market. I don't know.
I think. Oh,
go ahead. Yeah, I just wanted to encourage you to.
What I was going to say was that I also think that we should, really understand the importance of what Paulina mentioned earlier, that her grandmother got a PhD in physics in 1949, right? In 1957, I recently read a manpower planning council report from the United States, which was worried about the fact that this was American government information, that in 1957, the Soviet Union was graduating 13,000 engineers that were women every year. And in the United States, we were graduating far less than 100. And so this was an American government report saying, we have a problem. We are going to get our butts kicked in the space race if we don't start educating and training women in fields of science and engineering, right? Which the Soviets had been doing since the 20s. And I think that when you have these generations of women in science, I mean, we still have such a huge problem in the United States around STEM jobs being overwhelmingly male. And not surprisingly, they're also better paid than a lot of jobs in our economy. Whereas if you look at a country like Bulgaria or Romania, something like 30 to 40% of current engineers and people working in the technology sector are women, right? It's completely normal for women to go into these fields. There was a 2018 study that was done called Girls, Math, and Socialism. And in this study, they looked at all of the EU member states take a diagnostic test in mathematics, like middle school kids do this. And what they found, this was such an interesting study, it was done by German researchers, was that the gender gap in math in former socialist countries was considerably smaller than it was in capitalist countries, countries that had been capitalist since the Second World War. And in some of those East European countries, there was no gender gap at all. And this is 25 years after the collapse of socialism. So these rights for education and training and being able to have a professional career in what had been previously masculinized sectors of the economy were incredibly important and still have reverberations to this day. If we had women with PhDs in physics in 1949, we might have had a few, but they were a very small number. But the world would be much more hospitable in the American university today to women in physics, which is, it's not. It's still a very hostile place for women who want to go into these STEM fields. And I think it's important to realize that for all of their faults, and there were many faults, I want to emphasize what Paulina said, right? There are a lot of negative things here. We should not try to whitewash those things. But for all of their faults, there were these achievements, and we should not erase them retrospectively. We should remember that there were these moments where women's emancipation and love and sexual pleasure are part and parcel of a vision of the world which is much more just and equitable. And I just think that we should try to recapture some of that energy, not only in the public sphere but also in our private lives as much as we can. Anyway, do we want to take some questions from the audience, or I don't know, or do we want to just Todd?
Yeah.
Carrington?
Can I just add one more thing to pleasure? I think today's sex experts would emphasize two things when it comes to women's pleasure: that it's birth control and financial independence. Putting sex outside of context of reproduction and dependence on a male partner. And I think these two things were given to women in socialist countries. So just to answer very briefly to Paulina's question. But let's take some questions from
just to make sure that everybody knows how this technology works, you can all raise a hand. So you have this icon where you can sort of virtually raise your hand, and then we will be able to take a question from you, or you can write in the chat, and then we can refer to your question as well.
And also for people who are watching on Facebook Live, you can also post a question on Facebook, and Paulina is monitoring those questions as well, because I think there are some people that are watching only on Facebook.
That's correct. There are 26 listeners on Facebook, and I'm happy to monitor the questions in the comment section here. Anybody? You can just put a question in the chat. That's correct.
I might suggest that you all do maybe one more round while people are thinking of kind of comments, and then give people 5 minutes to kind of think of questions.
Right. I will ask my question again. So I hear again and again, you keep saying, yes, we need to give women, we have to make sure that women enter the fields of science and technology. We have to make sure that women have, that there is available sexual education. And We need to make sure that women have reproductive rights. And of course, you know, some of these things are really on the decline in some countries, like we can see in Poland with the reproductive rights. But at the same time, this agenda is heavily discussed by the Western feminists as well. We see it everywhere, you know, we see it in the US, we see it in Germany, we see it all over the place. You know, no Western feminist would, you know, ever disagree with any of this. So I'm going to provocatively ask you one more time, why do we need socialism for all of this? What is so special about it? What can we learn from it that is so different from capitalist take on equality?
Yeah, and here I'm just gonna, like, you know, again, I feel like in some ways this is an audience that's very aware of this argument, but it's probably worth rehearsing, right? That free markets discriminate against anyone who has primary caregiving responsibilities in the home. This is labor that is performed generally for free in the home, largely, although not exclusively, by women. And when you have a certain section of the population which is going in and out of the labor force, and we have seen this very clearly during the coronavirus pandemic, right? Where schools closed, kids are home, both parents are home, but who ends up doing the vast majority of the homeschooling? Who ends up doing the vast majority of the domestic labor that needs to happen? Who is leaving the labor force? In the United States, I believe in January, we had 3 million women leave the labor force because they have these domestic responsibilities at home. When you have somebody who is constantly moving in and out of the labor force because of caregiving responsibilities, employers factor in the unreliability of that labor in a free market system, and they lower the wages for those laborers. This is what's called statistical discrimination. So in a system where primary caregivers, because of their unreliability in the labor force, are given a lower wage, when you have, in this case, a heterosexual couple, and somebody needs to stay home with the children, either because of the coronavirus pandemic, or because childcare is inaccessible, or because you don't have access to healthcare, or you don't have access to sort of a broader social safety net, who's going to be the person to stay home? It's always going to be the person who earns the lower wage. And so this is a vicious cycle. It is statistical discrimination that feeds upon itself. And the only way to break that cycle is by state intervention in the market. And to the extent that in the United States, any form of state intervention in the market, especially around the expansion of social safety nets, is immediately jumped on by the right wing and called socialism. That's what it has to do with socialism. Socialism is about expanding social safety nets so that people have a floor under which they cannot fall, so that children have an equitable chance of having their basic needs met, of having education and healthcare and housing, and all of these things that we view as really important. And I think that, too often what happens in discussions of any form of socialism, and I know that people who are on this call are well aware of this in the United States context, is that if you talk about expanding social safety nets, immediately you're talking about the gulag and the famine and some kind of slippery slope to a gray, bleak totalitarian hell that is the Soviet Union in the 30s. And there are so many, it's not fair because you all are in Europe right now. You live in countries with large social democratic parties, large left parties. The political spectrum in Europe is so much wider and more robust than it is here in the United States, so that we have to fight for things that you take for granted, like universal health care, like subsidized childcare in kindergartens, like federally mandated paid parental leaves. We have none of that. And I think that that's where this conversation is so valuable for understanding that this is all very possible. And in fact, it's a reality in so many countries around the world.
And if I could add to that, I think another dimension here of the state versus the market is also how the development of expertise, which was so important in socialist Eastern Europe, how the development of expertise is being modeled on based on how the expertise is being financed. If it's financed by the market, in case of sexology or sex therapy or whatever related to sexuality, it's often financed by the pharmaceutical industry, which of course wants to sell more drugs. And then in the case of, for instance, Polish sexology, it was financed by the state. And Polish sexologists in the 70s or 80s, they just discuss issues which we could now call intersectionality in the approach to sexuality, because they believe that sexuality is developed, it's your sexual life is constructed by all things like not only gender, but also the economy, culture, society, religion, everything influence your sexual life and your relationships. So I think this is another dimension to what Kristen was saying, that in order to have a good expertise, you need to have an expertise which is independent from the market. But of course, it could serve other means under state socialism, but still it's a different model.
Thank you very much. We actually have quite a few questions on Facebook cropping up and here in the chat. So I will first let Joy-Ann to ask her question, because she was the first in the line, so to say, and then we will cover all the questions in the chat. Please, Joanne, you need to.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've never articulated this before, so I hope it comes out okay. I feel that at least since Harvey Weinstein's exposure as a rapist and serial harasser, we've been witnessing the increasing courage of so many women to speak up and expose the harassment they've experienced at work and in other places. And in a way we never have before. And in Ronin's book, he talks about how Weinstein even hired the former Israeli defense agents. And what's the name of that company they came from? Anyone remember? It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't call it forth right now. But it's the Blackwater, I think. But it's, no, not Blackwater, but something like that. It might have been Eric Prince's, one of his groups. But it's the first time I've heard people like this hired to fight claims of, you know, sexual harassment. So I thought that was an important term. But I haven't really seen much written by socialist feminists or the left on this type of development. You know, I think it's more than important men using an additional tool of power in their toolbox, because in my life and in the lives of other women, I've seen too many people of equal or lower status engage in similar behavior. Also in this country.
Sorry, do you think you could wrap up your question, because we have so many others? I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we have other people in the line here. Thank you.
So in the introduction, I remember the phrase was used, the social organization of intimacy. And I was wondering if, at least in research on Eastern Europe, the role of sexual violence and social harassment, etc., has been studied and written about in that context, within or outside of personal partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just say that Elizabeth Wood, who is a historian of Russia at MIT, has written a really interesting book called The Baba and the Comrade. And in that book, she actually looked at a variety of court cases and legislation in the Soviet Union in the 20s. And in the 20s, the Soviet Union was already trying to create a legal framework for sexual harassment, which is really fascinating because they understood that especially young women who were working at factories, sometimes alone at night, were often subject to harassment by the male foreman. So I think that, it's a question that hasn't been as well addressed in the Eastern Bloc. Again, I think maybe Kateřina or Agnieszka can talk about this in the Polish or Czechoslovak context, but I do think it's interesting that at least in the Soviet context in the 20s, leaders were aware of this problem and were trying to create a system of penalties so to discourage men from harassing their female employees.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was also addressed, I think, in one of the Polish sex education books from the 1950s, that women who work side by side by men in those male jobs, they should be treated with respect. And I think the problem of harassment of these women, sexual harassment at work, was recognized and addressed. But of course, this is not to say that countries like Poland were very good at preventing sexual violence, although I have to say that Poland had really, really progressive law when it comes to rape and more broadly sexual violence, and rape was really understood in much broader sense, but much was really broadly, a lot of sexual activity could be defined as rape legally, but of course the legal court trials were not always very well managed when it comes to stereotypes and victim blaming. I think that's kind of universal, East and West.
Thank you.
I have to summarize, I'm afraid, the questions that we have both on Facebook and here, sort of topically sort them so that we can address at least all the issues that people want to discuss. There are a few questions about how the socialist gender politics have been influencing and are still influencing the situation now in the Eastern European countries, whether gender relations in the families are still shaped by the previous politics, whether the public life is shaped like this as well. So maybe one of you to answer this question. Kateřina, would you like to say something on that?
I briefly mentioned earlier that people in the 90s and onwards were very keen on getting rid of this communist baggage. So I think that what would happen often in Eastern countries, including the Czech Republic and Slovakia, was that many things that were connected to gender equality were labeled as communist, and people were trying to distance themselves from them. And there was this renewed quest for femininity in the East, which manifested itself by at first run to porn shops, as Dagmar Herzog documented for East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or in many other Eastern countries, including Czechoslovakia and Czech Republic, by this attempted perfect motherhood, stay-at-home moms, endless extending of maternity leave, not parental, but maternity leave. Those were the features of the 1990s, and many of these new ideas from the progressive West, which we need to catch up with, was the slogan of the day. Those kind of shaped the decades to follow. And I think only recently the tide started to turn, in which people, at least some, have become more critical and maybe more deliberative about what was part of socialism, and maybe that what we can learn from the socialist past. But I think it would be very much contested still in present day Czech Republic if people specifically said, let's introduce this and that policy because it worked well in socialism. I don't think people would be open to hearing that. So I think this communist baggage was a big reason for people to kind of shy away from many things.
Yeah, but at the same time, all the women who had their PhDs in engineering or physics or, I don't know, anthropology, they were still there. And they, at least in Poland, they, in the 1990s, they still work at universities. And for instance, my department, which is anthropology department in Warsaw, had a female, when I started to work there, and I had a female boss. I had a female boss, and now we have a female dean. These are all the women who did their PhDs under socialism, and I think there was some kind of tradition of supporting female scholars. Maybe that could be seen as a heritage of socialism, because at least in anthropology, it's not so common to have so many female professors. I'm saying broadly, internationally, for instance, in the UK.
Thank you. We have another question on Facebook about homosexuality. How was that treated in behind the Iron Curtain? Because, you know, with all due respect to Czech and Polish sexologists, the discourse was very focused on reproductive health. It was very pronatalist. So can you say a few words about the perspective on homosexual life?
Should I say, or Kateřina, do you want to?
Go ahead, Agnieszka.
Okay, so Poland decriminalized homosexuality already in 1932. So even before becoming a socialist country. But when it comes to homosexual life under socialism, I think it was the major feature was invisibility, and you can think about invisibility in various ways, because you can say it was wrong, and then you need activism to make homosexual life and homosexual rights visible. But a few years ago, I did a whole series of interviews with senior gay men, and some of them, not all of them, but many of them were talking about the 70s as this really wonderful time when they have all those parties and they could do whatever they want because nobody could really see them. Nobody could call them homosexuals because this was really hidden in the public discourse. So quite a few of these men were talking about this really great life and great travel all around Eastern Bloc. They would go to Bulgaria for the vacation, and they have huge networks all over, and favorite baths and favorite cafes, but they were not. They didn't have any political identity. So, and then we can say it was wrong, but we can also try to understand why they cherish this time as a time that they could live full life in secret.
Let me add to this one thing which also applies to broader things than just homosexuality, but really ties into what Agnieszka just said, that we are measuring what liberation is by today's perspective. And today we have social movements and people can speak up and free themselves and identify themselves as this and that. And it's perfectly fine for many people, but this is not the only way sexual liberation can happen. People can be emancipated and liberated in many ways. And also at different times, liberation is something different. And we cannot do this, make this presentist mistake by measuring the past by the yardstick of today. And I think what we should try to do in order to educate ourselves and broaden our horizons is to understand how people back then lived and were happy and navigated life without things that we would otherwise think are indispensable, like gay movement and gay identity and LGBTQI. Those things were obviously not happening. And it also goes to the previous question about sexual harassment, right? The concept was not really there. So you have a different way of understanding society and social reality, given what is speakable in the public, and some things were not speakable. And exactly what Agnieszka just said, there was no clear connection of men, homosexual women, and lesbianism. There was lesbian, nobody knew what that was. So, you know, there are oral histories from Czechoslovakia where lesbian women who did not call themselves that, but who lived together, were bringing up children, were not called that by their environment, because the environment, their school, their neighbors, they just did not know that name. And I would insist that this is also a kind of freedom that we do not recognize today, and maybe even devalue because of this political organizing that we can do today. And that's all fine and good, but I would encourage us to recognize different kinds of freedom and emancipation that are the Western political liberal ones.
Thank you. I think it's actually a really important point about freedom from external conceptualizations. You know, at the absence of some concepts, we don't use them, and it may also have a liberating effect on us. There is a question in the chat which I think pertains to that discussion about what was psychoanalysis like behind the Iron Curtain, you know, because the way we talk about our lives now is so therapeutically imbued. You know, we use all these concepts from pop therapy, from pop psychology to talk about our lives, and harassment is also a part of this. What was it like behind the Iron Curtain? You know, was there a therapeutic turn there as well, or not? Kristen, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I defer to my colleagues on the, especially Agnieszka, I think has written a lot about the therapy culture around sexology. Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought that was a question to Kateřina, who wrote so much about the use of psychological concepts. But you know, maybe not narrowing down only to psychoanalysis, but more broadly to therapy. As I said earlier, the expertise was not so market dependent. So sex therapy was really developed as something really, really broad, which took into account not only physical problems, but also all sorts of psychological, but also culture, society dependent. So, and there was a lot of talks, and then coming back to the question on sexual violence, that you will not have a good sex life if there is violence. You will not have good sex life if you don't have space for it, and you will not have good sex life if you are uncertain about your future and you don't have, you know, money to feed your children. So I think all these things were taken into consideration, and I think that the good example to show how deep it went. So the sexology unit in Warsaw in the 1980s had a special, there was sub-unit to help transsexual patients, as they were called back then. So this unit hired a Catholic priest to help the transsexual patients to transition from men to women, or other way around, also spiritually in Catholic terms. So to become a Catholic woman or to become a Catholic man. So I think that was like really how deep the sex therapy was and how humanistic. And I think Czechoslovakia was different here, was more around the body than around the soul. But I think the Polish case shows very much the broad, very broad horizons of doctors from that period.
I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up now. We only have just a few minutes left, and there have also been questions in the chat which all pertain to the same category. I would say it's about basically, to summarize, what is more effective, emancipation from the above or emancipation from, you know, from the grassroots position, because we can see with the socialist example, we can clearly see how emancipation from the above works, and can we actually learn some lessons from this emancipation from the above for our grassroots work. I'll say each three of you has 30 seconds to say something, Jara, and then unfortunately we will have to stop here, and hopefully we'll come back to this wonderful topic sometime again. So Kristen, your shot, 30 seconds.
Well, all I will say is that I think that often the point of organizing from below is to influence the above. So these two things are always in dialectical relationship to each other, but you cannot achieve anything only from below. You have to also achieve some power from above. And as we have seen, I think the example of 20th century state socialism shows that a lot, at least for women and families, can be achieved by changes in the legal, political, and economic structures from above.
Thank you. Kateřina, you're the next one.
Yeah, from above is necessary. It can change much quicker because it's above, but also people might not cherish it so much and might not identify with it if they don't feel they haven't fought for it, which might be what the 90s in the East show us. So of course the combination is ideal, right? But it can get frustrating to be pushing and pushing and pushing from below with very little change. So from above really needs to happen in order for our lives to change.
Thank you. Agnieszka.
So I can briefly say that we need both. And I think if you look very closely at the history of state socialism, you could see that both were there, that experts, they responded to the state, but they also responded to the patient's concerns and to the reader concerns, and that there was a constant dialogue between doctors and the patients, and they often modified what they wrote earlier and what the state wanted from them in order to respond to these concerns. So I think that we should also see that there was a lot of dialogue, and it wasn't only from the above, and it's never only from grassroots. And I think that the proper way is just somewhere in between.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to all three of you. I very much hope that we will continue sometime soon, and that the DSA will want to talk to us again. And I'm passing it on to Carrington. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for such an engaging and informative panel. Really, really interesting. Really, I think we all really learned a lot. So please, if people can't see the Zoom chat, SocFem has listed ways you can get involved with them. Ali, maybe you could put those on the Facebook post for more people to see. And then we'll please stay tuned to the DSA's International Committee for ways you can get involved with us, whether as a member or even in leadership position. And we expect to have more panels like this. So yes, thank you all for coming out, for people watching, people participating, and yeah, look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
Yeah, and especially I want to thank Paulina and Kateřina and Agnieszka, who are all on Europe time, so it's quite late for them. So it was really lovely to have you guys Zoom in for this meeting, the beauty of technology. And thanks so much to SocFem and the International Committee for hosting us today.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, guys.